At my son's wedding reception, I stood behind the velvet curtain by the head table and heard my daughter-in-law laugh. "Pour more glue on it," she whispered. "When she stands, everyone will laugh." My son said coldly, "Mom needs to learn she no longer belongs here." I clenched my fists but stayed silent. I only switched 2 place cards. Hours later, when the MC invited the bride to stand, the sound of tearing fabric froze the entire ballroom. Thank you for listening. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever had to choose between loyalty to family and protecting someone you love, just yes or no? Your answer might help someone else feel less alone. Please note some details in this story have been adjusted for storytelling and reflection. What matters most is the lesson it carries. The sound of $12,000 worth of custom Italian silk tearing apart is something you never forget. It sounded like a scream. Saskia Whitfield, 31, and wrapped in every bride's dream dress, stood frozen on the dance floor as her wedding gown tore away from her body in front of 200 witnesses. The entire rear panel stayed bonded to the oak chair, like shed skin, while nude shapewear was exposed to a ballroom full of Boston's elite holding up phones. The MC had just announced them. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the floor for their first dance as husband and wife, Preston and Saskia Garrison. Spotlight swung across the Fairmont Copley Plaza Grand Ballroom and landed on my son and his new bride. Music began. Preston Garrison, 36, and sweating through his rented tuxedo, stood and extended his hand with practiced romantic gesture. Saskia smiled that perfect bride smile and placed her hand in his. Then she tried to stand. Nothing happened. She pushed harder. Her face reddened with effort under the spotlight. Confusion flickered across her features as 200 guests watched in silence. "Babe, get up!" Preston hissed loud enough that I heard it from my table 70 feet away. "Everyone is watching. Just stand up." Saskia planted her feet and pushed with full strength. This time her body rose 6 inches, but the 18-kilogram oak chair lifted with her. Her center of gravity couldn't get over her feet with the chair's weight attached. She crashed back down chair legs, slamming hardwood. I can't," she said, breathing hard. "I'm stuck. Something's wrong with the chair." Preston grabbed her arm and pulled upward, trying to help her stand. He lifted both his bride and the chair 3 feet off the ground before comprehending what was happening. Gravity won. They crashed down together, chair skidding sideways. That's when the dress gave up. The rip started at her waist and ran to the hem in one merciless line. $12,000 of custom Italian silk parted from industrial-strength epoxy like it was tissue paper. The entire back panel stayed glued to the chair while Saskia stood there in her bodice top and shapewear exposed to 200 phones capturing everything. The sound she made wasn't a scream. It was worse. It was the sound of a person realizing they'd been trapped. I sat at my table, hands folded, and watched my son's wedding implode. I didn't move. I didn't help. I didn't even blink. But to understand why I sat there like a statue while my daughter-in-law was humiliated in front of 200 of Boston's elite, you have to go back 3 hours. I arrived at the Fairmont Copley Plaza at 5:30 in the afternoon, 3 hours before the reception would begin. At 69, with hands scarred from 4 decades of building Boston's harbor infrastructure, I'd learned one fundamental rule: you check the foundation before you pour the concrete. The ballroom was empty, semi-dark quiet, except for soft, classical music playing through hidden speakers. White hydrangeas covered every surface, Lorraine's favorite. My wife had been planning this wedding for 8 months, ever since Preston announced his engagement. Every detail mattered to her. I walked the perimeter, slowly checking sight lines, chair spacing, lighting. The head table sat on a raised platform with perfect view of the dance floor. I counted the guest table's 20 rounds of 10 crisp white linens crystal catching light from the chandeliers. Everything was perfect. You check the site before the crew arrives. I thought running my hand along the back of a chair at the head table. You check the foundation before you pour the concrete. 42 years of construction work had taught me that preparation prevents catastrophe. I stood at the head table and looked out over the empty ballroom, imagining it filled with guests, with music, with celebration. Today was supposed to be the culmination of everything I'd built. Not just the wedding, the legacy. Preston was my only son. 36 years old, Harvard-educated, ready to take over Garrison Maritime Construction. I'd spent 4 decades building that company from nothing into a Boston institution. We'd converted half the harbor warehouses into luxury residential spaces. We'd rebuilt 3 major piers. We'd employed hundreds of families. And today, I would hand him the keys. Today, I build a dynasty I thought, feeling pride swell in my chest. Lorraine loves white hydrangeas, I reminded myself, adjusting one of the centerpieces. Everything has to be perfect for her. She'd been recovering from a broken pelvis for 6 weeks. Hairline fracture L4 and L5. Physical therapy 3 times a week. The doctor had been very clear: no sudden movements, no jerking, no stress on the lower spine. I'd made sure her chair at the head table had extra cushioning. I'd verified the spacing so she could use her cane easily. I'd thought of everything. The ballroom felt peaceful in the semi-darkness. I breathed in the scent of hydrangeas and let myself imagine the evening ahead. Preston in his tuxedo, Saskia in her custom gown. Lorraine smiling as she watched our son start his new life. A family legacy built to last. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in an empty ballroom. A giggle, not a happy one. Low, conspiratorial, cruel. I stopped moving. The sound came from behind the velvet curtains near the head table, stage left. The curtains were drawn across the service entrance where catering staff would bring out food later. Someone was back there. I moved quietly toward the sound. Decades of walking construction sites, teaching me how to step without noise. The giggle came again, followed by a male voice I recognized instantly. Preston. My son was behind that curtain 3 hours before his wedding reception, laughing like he'd just pulled off the perfect prank. I stopped behind the massive velvet curtain, staying in the shadows. My eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the fabric. What I saw made my blood run cold. Saskia was leaning over my wife's chair with an orange tube in her hand. Construction-grade epoxy. The same 2-part industrial formula I'd used for 42 years to bond marble to concrete steel to stone permanence to permanence. She was applying it to the velvet seat cushion in a thick U-shaped line, careful and precise like she'd practiced. Preston stood beside her with his phone out, thumbs moving. "Make sure you get the edges, babe," he whispered. His voice carried in the empty ballroom. "I want her stuck good. She needs to learn her place." Saskia laughed, that cruel, low giggle I'd heard from across the room. "When the old hag tries to stand up for the toast, she's going to be flopping around like a fish. Maybe she'll finally break that other hip and we can put her in a home sooner." My hands clenched into fists. The old hag. My wife. Lorraine, who'd spent 8 months planning every detail of this wedding. Lorraine, who'd broken her pelvis 6 weeks ago and was still going to physical therapy 3 times a week because she refused to miss her only son's wedding. Lorraine, who the doctor had explicitly warned could suffer permanent paralysis if her hip was jerked or twisted wrong. I remembered that appointment. 7 weeks ago, Mass General Hospital Orthopedic Wing. Preston had driven us because Lorraine couldn't sit in a car for long periods yet. We'd sat in Dr. Hendrix's office while he showed us the x-rays. "The fracture is healing well," Dr. Hendrix had said, pointing to the hairline crack across her L4 vertebra. "But the bone fragment here is still mobile. If there is a sudden jerk or twist of the hip, the fragment could shift, pinching the sciatic nerve. Worst-case scenario, partial paralysis from the hip down. Preston had been in that room. He'd heard every word. He'd driven us home and helped his mother into the house, so careful, so gentle. And now he was standing behind a velvet curtain, watching his bride glue his mother to a chair, hoping she'd flop around like a fish. "There," Saskia said, admiring her work. "Perfect. The epoxy needs about 3 hours to cure completely. By the time she sits down at 8 o'clock, it'll be invisible and rock solid." "You're a genius," Preston said, pulling her close and kissing her neck. "After tonight, after she makes a scene trying to stand up, and everyone sees how pathetic she is, Dad will have to agree she needs professional care. And once she's in a facility, the penthouse is ours," Saskia finished. 2.3 million, baby. Back Bay, our names on the deed." They kissed again, long and deep, celebrating in advance. I stood frozen behind the curtain, every muscle in my body screaming, to move, to confront them, to grab my son by his rented tuxedo and throw him through the nearest window. But 42 years of building things teaches you something essential. You don't win a war by charging into machine gun fire. You win by flanking the enemy. Preston and Saskia gathered their things: the epoxy tube, a few paper towels, Preston's alibi-building phone, and slipped out through the service entrance, still giggling. I waited 30 seconds. Then I stepped out from behind the curtain. The ballroom was silent again, except for the classical music. I walked to the head table and looked down at Lorraine's chair. The place card sat in its silver holder, Lorraine Garrison, mother of the groom. The epoxy was nearly invisible on the dark velvet, tacky to the touch, but still active. In 3 hours, it would be rock solid. Anyone who sat in that chair would be bonded to it like steel to concrete. I know that epoxy. I've used it to bond foundations that hold up 30-story buildings. It doesn't just stick, it fuses. And my son had been smiling while he planned to use it on his own mother. I reached for the place card. Then I stopped. The epoxy was already past its working phase. I knew the formula. I'd used it on harbor projects for 4 decades. Once it begins bonding, solvent removal leaves residue. Scrubbing the velvet would leave a visible mark, a discoloration, a disturbance in the fabric that any careful eye would notice. And Saskia had careful eyes. She would know someone had found her trap. She would adjust. She would find another way. No. Leave the chair exactly as she prepared it. Let her believe everything went according to plan. I just needed to make sure the right person was sitting in it. I pulled out my phone and opened my messages. Celeste Mercer, my executive assistant of 14 years, had sent me the final documents that morning: deed transfer for the Back Bay penthouse succession paperwork, for Garrison Maritime Construction Trust Fund activation. Everything ready to be filed Monday morning, September 17th, making Preston the legal owner of everything I'd spent 4 decades building. I typed, "Hold everything. Do not file the deed. Wait for my call." Her response came back in 15 seconds. "Understood. All transfers frozen." I put the phone away and looked back at the chair with Saskia's trap. The chair meant for Lorraine. I reached for Lorraine's place card, lifted it from its holder, and set it aside. Then I walked 3 seats down and picked up another card: Saskia Garrison Bride. I placed Saskia's card in Lorraine's holder. Then I placed Lorraine's card in the clean chair 3 seats away, with extra cushioning I'd verified that morning, positioned perfectly for her cane. "Now, sir, guests aren't supposed to be in here yet." I turned. Colin Hayes, a young waiter carrying a tray of water glasses, stood near the kitchen entrance, looking at me with mild suspicion. I smiled, warm, grandfatherly, the face of a man who'd spent 40 years charming city inspectors and union negotiators. "I know, son. I'm just checking the spacing for my wife." She has trouble walking, you know. Wanted to make sure everything was perfect. His expression softened immediately. Oh, you're the father of the groom. Guilty as charged, I said, still smiling. Just a worried old man making sure his wife will be comfortable. Is that all right? Of course, sir. Take your time. He disappeared back into the kitchen. I looked down at the rearranged place cards. Saskia's name now sat above the chair with 3 hours' worth of industrial-strength epoxy curing into the velvet. The same chair where she would sit at 8 o'clock tonight in her custom Italian silk gown, expecting to watch her mother-in-law humiliate herself. I walked out to the bar in the empty lobby, ordered a double scotch, downed it in one go. The alcohol burned, but it didn't burn as hot as the anger in my gut. I put the phone in my pocket and walked toward the hotel entrance. The trap was set. The prey was already on their way in, and the only question left was how long it would take them to realize they had walked into their own war. In 3 hours, that epoxy would be fully cured, and my daughter-in-law would discover exactly what happens when you set a trap for someone who built the foundation you're standing on. Lorraine arrived at 6 o'clock with a smile I hadn't seen in 7 weeks, the smile of a woman who believed she was gaining a daughter tonight. Lorraine Garrison, 65, and leaning heavily on her cane after pelvic surgery, met me at the Fairmont Copley Plaza revolving doors. She wore the navy dress she'd spent 3 weeks finding wide enough at the hips to avoid pressure on her healing pelvis, beautiful enough not to feel like a burden at her only son's wedding. "Do I look all right, Ernest?" she asked, smoothing the fabric nervously. "I don't want to embarrass Preston." I took her free hand and kissed it. "You look the best in the room, Lorraine. You always have." Her smile brightened. She squeezed my arm as I offered it, transferring her weight carefully. The cane clicked against marble as we moved toward the ballroom entrance, slow measured steps, exactly the pace her orthopedic surgeon had prescribed. "Oh, I think today we'll have a real family," she said, voice soft with hope. "Saskia seems so lovely. I'm so happy for our son." My throat tightened. 3 weeks she'd spent searching for that dress. 3 weeks of online shopping and department store visits, trying on dozens of options, searching for something that would make her feel beautiful while accommodating the titanium pins holding her pelvis together. She'd modeled each dress for me via video call, turning slowly, wincing when certain fabrics pulled wrong, asking my opinion, like I knew the first thing about women's fashion. But I knew what she was really asking. Will I be good enough? Will I make Preston proud? I'd told her every single one was perfect. I told her she could wear a potato sack and still be the most elegant woman in the room. She'd chosen the navy one because it matched my eyes. We moved through the lobby, her cane marking time against the marble. Click, step, click, step. The rhythm of recovery. The rhythm of a woman who'd been told by her orthopedic surgeon that she might never walk without assistance again, but who refused to miss her son's wedding. A woman who'd heard the same doctor say that sudden jerking or twisting could cause permanent paralysis. A woman whose son had heard those same words and decided to glue her to a chair. "The flowers are beautiful," Lorraine said as we approached the ballroom entrance. "The hydrangeas, you remembered." Of course I remembered. She trusted me. For 42 years she had trusted me completely. And I was leading her into a ballroom where her own son had prepared a trap for her. Except the trap wasn't for her anymore. I'd made sure of that. We reached the ballroom entrance. Music played softly, string quartet, Pachelbel's Canon Lorraine's choice. White hydrangeas covered every surface. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over 20 tables arranged in perfect symmetry. And at the entrance, standing in the receiving line like royalty, Preston and Saskia greeted their guests. Preston saw us first. Something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe confusion, but it vanished quickly, replaced by his practiced smile. The smile he'd perfected at Harvard, the smile that charmed investors and closed deals. the smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mom, Dad." He opened his arms. Lorraine released my arm and moved toward him, careful with her cane. Preston hugged her, brief, light, the kind of hug you give a distant relative at a funeral. Then Saskia stepped forward. Mom." Her voice carried across the entrance, bright and performative. Several nearby guests turned to look. "You made it. You look fine." She leaned in for a kiss, air, only lips hovering 2 inches from Lorraine's cheek. Couldn't risk smudging the makeup. Couldn't risk actually touching the woman she'd just called Mom. Then Saskia's hand touched Lorraine's elbow, guiding her slightly away from the other guests. Her voice dropped to a confidential tone, concerned, caring, the kind of voice you use when delivering bad news to someone you love. "Listen," Saskia said, and I saw Lorraine lean in, wanting to hear, wanting to please. "We have a lot of important people here tonight. Just find your seat and stay there, okay? You're moving so slowly with that cane, it's frankly a little depressing to watch. I don't want you bothering the guests or having your cane in every single photograph. You understand, right?" Lorraine's face changed. It wasn't dramatic. No tears, no gasp, no visible collapse. Just a small shift in her expression, a light going out behind her eyes, a smile fading into something polite and empty. I didn't mean to." Lorraine's voice trembled. "I'm sorry. You're right. Thank you, dear." "Thank you." She thanked her. I looked at Preston. My son. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike, to throw a baseball, to shake hands with a firm grip and look men in the eyes. The young man I'd sent to Harvard, who'd called me every Sunday for 4 years to talk about his classes, his dreams, his future. He stood 3 feet away. He'd heard every word Saskia said. He adjusted his tie and looked away. Said nothing. Did nothing. Just adjusted his tie and turned to greet the next guest in line, leaving his mother standing there with her cane and her carefully chosen navy dress and her apology for existing. The light in her eyes died. Just like that. One sentence from the daughter-in-law she was trying so hard to love, and the hope extinguished. "Come on," I said quietly, offering my arm again. "Let me help you to the table." Lorraine took my arm. Her hand shook slightly. "She's right, you know," Lorraine whispered as we moved into the ballroom. "I am moving slowly. I shouldn't be in all the pictures. I don't want to ruin their special day." "You could never ruin anything," I said. But I was lying, because in 2 hours, the woman who had just banished my wife to her seat would discover exactly what happens when you sit exactly where you're told. Lorraine thanked her. She actually thanked the woman who had just told her she was too broken to be seen. That was who Lorraine was. She apologized for existing. And that was exactly why she needed me to be who I am. As we moved to our seats, Saskia was too busy waving at the VIP guests and flashing her practiced smile for the cameras to even glance at the place cards. She swirled into the center position by pure habit. Meanwhile, I watched Preston's face as he approached the head table, his eyes darting from his mother's seat to the empty chair beside it, confusion flickering as he realized the geometry was wrong. Lorraine leaned on my arm as we reached the table. "Is this right, Ernest?" she asked, looking at the place cards. I thought the mother of the groom sat on the end. Her name card sat 3 seats from the end, exactly where I'd moved it. The clean chair. The safe chair. The one with extra cushioning I'd verified that morning. "Trust me, honey," I said, pulling out the chair for her. "The lighting is better here. You'll look better in the photos." She smiled, small, grateful, still trying so hard to not be a burden. I helped her sit slowly, her hands gripping the armrests, as she lowered herself, carefully mindful of the titanium pins holding her pelvis together. Safe. Preston stood 3 feet away, mouth opening like he wanted to speak. His eyes moved from his mother to the chair at the end of the table, the chair with Saskia's name card, the chair he and his bride had spent 7 minutes preparing 3 hours ago. the chair where his mother was supposed to sit. But before Preston could form words, the MC's voice boomed through the ballroom speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Dinner service will begin momentarily." 200 guests moved toward their tables in a coordinated rush. Music swelled. Waiters appeared from the kitchen carrying trays. Preston's mouth closed. Saskia swept toward the head table, trailing silk and tulle, smiling for the phones that followed her every move. She reached her assigned seat, the end chair, the one with perfect sight lines for photographs, and turned her back to it. She fluffed the layers of her gown, spreading them wide for the cameras, adjusted the train, smoothed the bodice, every movement choreographed for Instagram. Then she sat down hard, the Italian silk compressed against the velvet cushion. 3 hours of curing time had turned the industrial epoxy tacky, clingy, molecularly aggressive. The kind of adhesive that doesn't just stick, it fuses. Saskia stood immediately fussing with her train, pulling fabric forward so it wouldn't wrinkle. Then she sat again, even harder this time, wiggling her hips to settle the layers of silk and tulle firmly into place. Every wiggle spread the adhesive. Every adjustment locked her in. She was sealing her own fate with her own vanity, grinding $12,000 of Italian silk into construction-grade epoxy while she smiled for cameras. Preston slid into his seat beside her. He looked at me across the table. I raised my champagne glass and stared back without smiling. He looked away first. The ballroom settled into dinner service rhythm. Conversations rose and fell like waves. Silverware clinked against china. The string quartet shifted into something soft and elegant that Lorraine had chosen months ago. Waiters appeared with the first-course lobster bisque, $85 per serving, presented in white porcelain bowls with a drizzle of truffle oil. Saskia took a photo before tasting it. Preston checked his phone beneath the table. Lorraine ate slowly, carefully, trying not to draw attention to herself. I pulled out my own phone. Beneath the white tablecloth hidden from view, I opened my messages and typed. "Cancel the honeymoon package. Flights, hotel, everything. Non-refundable, cancel anyway." Celeste's response came back in 12 seconds. Confirmed. Maldives Resort business class flights, private villa. Total value $25,400. Cancelled, forfeited. I typed again, pull Preston's name from the monthly account. Effective immediately. Another 12 seconds. Done. Access revoked. He'll see the change Monday morning when rent comes due. I set the phone face down on my lap and reached for my wine glass. Cabernet. 2015. Full-bodied expensive, the kind Preston had told me he liked when we'd discussed the wine selection. I'd paid for cases of it. I'd made sure it was poured at every table. Ironic, I took a slow sip, letting it sit on my tongue. Blackberry oak, a hint of tobacco. $48 a bottle. Preston raised his own glass across the table, toasting Saskia, toasting their future, toasting a life built on my money and my dead wife's humiliation. The message on my phone showed delivered. $25,000 vanished from their future, while they raised champagne glasses and clinked crystal. Saskia shifted in her seat, adjusting the layers of her dress again. More wiggling, more settling. More pressure distributing the epoxy across every thread of silk touching that velvet cushion. She had no idea, neither did he. They sat there eating lobster bisque, drinking champagne, accepting congratulations from guests who stopped by the head table to offer blessings. Saskia smiled that perfect smile. Preston shook hands with that firm grip I'd taught him, and with every passing minute, the chemical reaction beneath Saskia's dress accelerated. Body heat activated the epoxy's final curing stage. Pressure created surface area for molecular bonding. Time did what time does, made permanent what was temporary. I'd used that same formula to bond steel to concrete on harbor projects that would stand for 100 years. It would hold a woman to a chair for 3 hours easy. Lorraine touched my hand. "Are you all right?" she whispered. You seem tense. I'm fine, I said, squeezing her fingers. Just thinking about the toast later. You don't have to give one if you don't want to, she said. I know public speaking isn't your favorite. Public speaking? I almost laughed. Lorraine thought I was nervous about a toast. She had no idea that in 90 minutes I was going to stand in front of 200 of Boston's elite and deliver something very different than a father's blessing. The waiters cleared the bisque bowls. Preston's was still half full, too busy on his phone to eat. Saskia's was empty, scraped clean. She'd even taken a piece of sourdough from the bread basket, the kind Lorraine loved, the kind she'd been told not to eat, because carbs cause inflammation. I checked my watch. 6:50 p.m. The main course was still 40 minutes away. 40 minutes of salad, of small talk, of Saskia sitting in her trap while the adhesive cured into permanence. I had time. I was patient. I'd waited 42 years to build an empire. I could wait 40 minutes to watch it be earned by someone who actually deserved it. But patience only lasts so long when you're watching your wife be dismantled piece by piece. The salad course arrived with a basket of fresh-baked sourdough bread, and my wife's hand reached for it with the hesitation of someone who had learned to ask permission for basic human needs. The bread was still warm from the kitchen. I could smell the yeast, the crust, the butter melting in the basket's linen. Lorraine loved sourdough, the crusty kind with air pockets and real chew. She'd told me that the first week we dated 43 years ago, when I'd taken her to a bakery in the North End, her fingers hovered over a particularly good piece, the end slice with the darkest crust. "Mom!" Saskia's voice cut across the table like a blade. Lorraine's hand froze. "Are you sure you want to eat that?" Saskia leaned forward, her voice dripping with fake concern, loud enough that the guests at the neighboring table could hear. "Carbs cause inflammation. Every gram of starch is extra pressure on your hip. You don't want to go back to the hospital, do you?" Lorraine's hand retreated like she'd touched fire. "You're right," she said quietly. "Thank you, dear." "Thank you." My wife thanked the woman who had just stolen food from her plate. "I'll listen to Saskia, Mom," Preston said, not even looking up from his own plate. His mouth was half full of the filet mignon that had just been served, 24 ounces of perfectly seared beef he was devouring like a teenager. "She knows about nutrition. You don't want to blow out your other hip eating bread. Blow out your other hip, like she was a tire, like her body was something disposable that could be discarded when it stopped performing." Lorraine set her hands in her lap. She looked at her salad, mixed greens, candied pecans, goat cheese, and picked up her fork with the careful movements of someone trying to disappear. I reached across the table, picked up that exact piece of sourdough she'd wanted, pulled the butter dish toward me, spread it thick, real butter, European style, the kind that costs $8 a pound. And I ate it, slowly, deliberately, staring straight ahead while I chewed. The bread was perfect. Crispy crust, soft interior butter melting into every air pocket. I took another bite, then another. I finished the entire piece while Preston and Saskia watched. Neither of them said a word. Lorraine's hand found mine beneath the table. Squeezed once. I squeezed back. My wife thanked the woman who had just stolen food from her plate. I set down my wine glass and said nothing. Some lessons only land when the foundation finally gives way. The dinner service continued. Conversations flowed around us. The string quartet played something classical that Lorraine had chosen. Guests laughed, toasted, celebrated. And at the head table under the white hydrangeas and crystal chandeliers, my son and his bride systematically dismantled the woman who'd spent 8 months planning their perfect day. 20 minutes later, Maya Frost, the wedding photographer, circled the head table with her camera raised, capturing candid moments for the album Saskia had spent months planning. She moved quietly, professionally, catching angles and expressions, the kind of work that would fill 50 pages of leather-bound memories. Maya crouched near Lorraine's end of the table, adjusting her lens, Saskia noticed immediately. Her eyes locked onto something in the frame. Her perfect smile flickered. Mom, she said, her voice sweet as honey for the photographer's benefit. Your cane, could you tuck it under the chair? It doesn't match our color scheme. Lorraine looked down. Her cane leaned against her chair exactly where I'd positioned it 3 hours ago, within easy reach, stable, safe. The way her physical therapist had instructed. The way her orthopedic surgeon had required. Oh, Lorraine said. I'm sorry, of course. She started to bend. I saw the wince cross her face, that micro-expression she tried to hide whenever the titanium pins in her pelvis pulled wrong. The doctor had been explicit, no bending at the waist for another 6 weeks. No twisting. No reaching. But here she was, trying to contort herself under a table to hide her medical equipment, because it didn't match the color scheme. I placed my hand on her shoulder. I've got it, I said. I reached down and took the cane. Dark wood ergonomic grip, the kind recommended by her physical therapist. I held it firmly in my right hand, upright, visible exactly where it belonged. Then I looked directly at Saskia. It stays here, I said. Within her reach. In every single photograph, if necessary. The table went quiet. Maya's camera lowered slightly. Saskia's smile stayed perfectly in place, but it didn't reach her eyes. It never did. Of course, she said, her voice still honey-sweet. I was only thinking of you, Dad. I know how you care about presentation. I thought you'd want the photos to look clean. Clean, as if my wife's disability was dirt. The photos will look honest, I said. That's all they need to be. Maya raised her camera again and took the shot, the whole table, the white hydrangeas, the crystal glasses, the candlelight. And yes, Lorraine's cane held upright in my hand, visible in the frame. Exactly where it should be. Saskia turned back to Preston, her smile locked in place, her hand finding his on the table. She leaned in and whispered something in his ear. He nodded, squeezed her hand, kissed her cheek. Perfect couple, perfect wedding, perfect life. Except for the mother-in-law with the cane who didn't match the color scheme. Except for the father-in-law who refused to play along. Maya moved on to the next table, capturing more candid moments, more joy, more celebration. I set Lorraine's cane back against her chair, within reach, where it belonged. Thank you, Lorraine whispered. I don't thank me, I said. It's your cane. You need it. End of discussion. She nodded, but her eyes were wet. Across the table, Saskia's smile didn't reach her eyes. It never did. She said she was thinking of me. She was thinking of the photographs, of her aesthetic of controlling every detail down to whether a disabled woman could have her medical equipment in frame. There's a difference between caring about someone and caring about how they look. And she knew I knew the difference. The filet mignon arrived, perfectly seared, rosemary and garlic rising from the plates. And in the fleeting moment when Saskia turned to talk with her maid of honor, Lorraine reached out and touched Preston's hand with the desperate hope of a mother asking if any part of her son still remembered who raised him. You look so handsome tonight, sweetheart, she said quietly. Her voice carried all the love she'd poured into him for 36 years. I'm so proud of you. Preston looked down at her hand on his. For 1 second, just 1 second, I saw something flicker in his eyes. A remnant. A ghost of the boy who used to call me every Sunday from Harvard. The boy who'd helped his mother plant tomatoes in the backyard. The boy who'd cried the first time he'd had to put his childhood dog down. The boy I'd raised. Then it died. Extinguished by choice. I'd just eat your food, Mom, he said, pulling his hand away. Don't make things awkward between us. Lorraine's face crumpled for half a second, before she smoothed it back into something neutral, something safe. Right, she whispered. I'm sorry. She pulled her hand back and picked up her fork. Cut a small piece of the filet. Ate it without tasting it, I'm sure. Her eyes stayed on her plate. I wanted to reach across the table and grab my son by his rented tuxedo. I wanted to ask him when exactly he'd become the kind of man who told his mother not to touch him. When he'd decided that showing affection to the woman who'd carried him for 9 months was awkward. But I didn't, because a man can blame his wife for many things. But he cannot blame her for the choices he makes with his own mouth to his own mother. Preston had a choice. In that 1-second flicker, I'd seen him recognize what he was doing. I'd seen him understand it was cruel. And he'd chosen it anyway. That wasn't Saskia's influence. That was Preston, my son. The dinner service continued. Filet mignon, roasted Brussels sprouts, truffle-infused potatoes. $92 a plate. Preston ate like he'd earned it. 10 minutes later, Saskia swiveled in her seat, shifting her weight again, spreading the epoxy deeper into the silk layers of her dress, and addressed me directly. "Shut," she said, her voice carrying that bright, performative cheerfulness she used when she wanted something. "We need to discuss the timeline for the penthouse. The interior is very dated. Dated." She was calling dated the Brazilian hardwood I'd imported myself. The marble countertops I'd chosen from a quarry in Tuscany. The floor-to-ceiling windows I'd designed to catch morning light over Boston Harbor. 14 months I'd spent building that penthouse. 14 months of walking the site, checking every beam, every wire, every tile. Not because I had to, I had crews for that, but because it was for my son. All that dark wood and marble. Saskia continued wrinkling her nose. "It feels like an old man's office. We want to gut it." Preston leaned forward, nodding. "Yeah, Dad. It's depressing. We got to quote $80,000 for demo and remodel. Since the deed transfer's Monday, we were hoping you could front us the costs now, so we can start while we're on our honeymoon. $80,000. To rip out the work I'd done with my own hands. To replace Brazilian hardwoods with whatever Instagram told them was trendy this month. We want to take out the jacuzzi tub," Saskia added, pulling out her phone to show me photos. "Replace it with a minimalist white concrete wet room. Very clean, very modern, and the living room needs to be completely opened up, knock down that wall paint, everything white, get rid of the built-in bookshelves. They're so heavy. Heavy. I'd built those bookshelves myself. Solid oak. They'd last 100 years. We have it all planned," Preston said, smiling like he was doing me a favor by letting me pay for it. "We just need the money up front. You know, to get started before we leave for the Maldives next week." The Maldives. The honeymoon I'd already canceled 4 hours ago. I looked at them. My son and his bride. Planning renovations, planning their future, planning to destroy everything I'd built and replace it with white concrete and emptiness, planning to move into a home they would never own. I pulled out my phone beneath the table, typed slowly, deliberately, while they talked about Instagram-worthy aesthetics and influencer recommendations. List the penthouse, Back Bay, full asking price, furnished, change the locks tonight. Celeste's response came back in 8 seconds. On it. Listing goes live in 1 hour. Locksmith dispatched. ETA 40 minutes. I set the phone face down on my lap, looked up at Preston and Saskia, smiled. "Let me think about it," I said. Saskia clapped her hands together, delighted. "Oh my God, thank you, Dad. You're the best." She turned to Preston and kissed his cheek, then leaned in close to whisper in his ear. But she whispered too loud. Or maybe I just hear everything. "See," she said. "I told you he'd do it. We just have to push him a little. Push him. Like I was a button. Like I was a resource to be manipulated." Preston grinned, squeezed her hand, raised his champagne glass in my direction, like we were in this together. I raised mine back, drank, tasted nothing. Across the table, Lorraine pushed food around her plate. She'd barely eaten, too ashamed to reach for bread, too afraid to make things awkward with her son, too broken by a day that was supposed to celebrate family. I looked at Preston and Saskia planning Instagram posts for their new aesthetic. Somewhere in Back Bay, a locksmith was already on his way, already pulling tools from his van, already changing the locks on a penthouse they would never see the inside of again. The deed would never transfer. The keys would never be theirs. The $80,000 they wanted to gut my work would never materialize. But they didn't know that yet. They sat there eating filet mignon, drinking champagne, whispering about how easy it was to push me. And I sat there watching the clock, waiting for the moment when they'd realize that the foundation they thought they were standing on had never been theirs at all. The 5-tier wedding cake rolled in on a silver cart to applause, and I watched Lorraine's face light up not with hunger, but with memory, because she had baked Preston a birthday cake by hand every single year for 36 years, and this was the first one she wasn't allowed to taste. Vanilla raspberry, Preston's favorite, the same flavor Lorraine had baked for every birthday from age 1 through 35. The same flavor she'd perfected over decades, learning exactly how much vanilla extract he liked, exactly how much raspberry preserve to fold into the layers without making them soggy. She'd stopped baking them last year. Preston had told her he was trying to eat clean, told her homemade cakes were too heavy, too many calories, too unsophisticated for his new lifestyle. But here it was, 5 tiers of vanilla raspberry. Professional, perfect, expensive, and Lorraine reached toward it with quiet hope. Just a small slice, just a taste of the flavor she'd given her son for 3 decades. Saskia's hand shot out. Mom. The word came out sweet, concerned, exactly the tone you'd use with a child reaching for something dangerous. You're not eating cake, are you? Lorraine's hand stopped mid-reach. Sugar causes inflammation. Saskia continued leaning in close, her voice dropping to that fake confidential tone that made cruelty sound like care. Really, I'm telling you this because I love you. Your face looks a bit swollen already. Just stick to water with lemon. It'll help flush out the toxins. Swollen. She just told my wife her face looked swollen. Lorraine's hand dropped to her lap. Listen to Saskia, Mom, Preston said, not even looking up from the massive slice he was cutting for himself. The knife sank through 5 layers of vanilla raspberry, through buttercream frosting, through fresh raspberries arranged between tiers. Detox. You want to look good for the family photos, don't you? He lifted his slice easily a 1/4 of a tier and took a bite. Closed his eyes, made a small sound of appreciation. God, this is good, he said, mouth full. Lorraine folded her napkin, set it beside her untouched plate. Right, she whispered. I'm not hungry anyway. Not hungry. She'd barely eaten all night. She'd skipped the bread when Saskia warned about inflammation. She'd turned down the salad when she saw Preston's disapproving look. She'd barely touched her filet mignon, cutting it into smaller and smaller pieces, but never quite bringing them to her mouth. And now she was turning down her own son's wedding cake. The cake for the boy she had raised, the flavor she had baked for him every year since he could blow out candles. And she was apologizing for it. Something inside me hardened into steel. Not anger. Anger is hot, reactive, temporary. This was colder, permanent. The kind of resolve that sets into a foundation and holds for 100 years. I set down my fork, deliberately, loud enough that it clinked against the china. The sound cut through the conversation at our table. Eat the cake, Lorraine, I said. Not quietly, not whispered. Loud enough that the tables nearest us could hear. Loud enough that the couple to our left stopped mid-conversation. Eat a large slice of it, I continued. You're going to need the energy. Lorraine looked at me, eyes wide. Saskia's smile tightened. Ernest, really don't undermine me. I'm trying to help her. You've done enough, Saskia. I turned to look at her, not at her face, past her face, into whatever hollow space existed where empathy should have lived. You've done enough. The words came out quiet, calm, final, the kind of tone I used on construction sites when I told a contractor they were done, when I told them to pack their tools and leave and never bid on another one of my projects again. The kind of tone that didn't need volume because the certainty carried it. Saskia's smile froze. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. She started. "So I know what you were doing," I said. The table to our left had stopped eating. The couple there, Richard and Margaret Ellis, shipping insurance friends of mine for 20 years, were watching now. Not even pretending to look away. Saskia felt it. The shift, the attention, the witness. I don't think you understand," she said, her voice still trying for sweet, but landing somewhere near brittle. "I'm trying to help Lorraine make healthy choices for her recovery. Sugar really does cause—" "You've done enough," I repeated. 3 words. Same tone. Absolute. Preston set down his fork. "Dad, what's your problem?" "My problem," I said, still looking at Saskia, "is watching my wife, who spent 8 months planning this wedding, who broke her pelvis 6 weeks ago and is still in physical therapy, who baked you a birthday cake every year for 36 years, apologize for wanting a single slice of cake at your wedding." The words hung in the air. Richard Ellis nodded slowly, like something had just been confirmed. Saskia's face flushed. She started. "You told her she looked swollen," I said. "At her son's wedding, in front of guests, while eating your own cake." Lorraine's hand found mine beneath the table. Squeezed. "Ernest," she whispered. "It's fine. I don't need—" "Yes," I said, turning to her. "You do." I reached for the cake server. Cut a slice, not small, not apologetic. A real slice, the kind you serve someone you want to celebrate. Set it on a clean plate. Placed it in front of Lorraine, picked up a fork, and set it beside the plate. "Eat," I said. Not a request, not a suggestion, a statement. Lorraine looked down at the cake. Vanilla raspberry. The flavor she knew by heart. The flavor she'd perfected for her son. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the fork. Saskia opened her mouth again. I looked at her. She closed it. Lorraine took a bite. Small, careful. Then another. Her eyes closed for just a moment. When she opened them, they were wet. "It's good," she whispered. Saskia's smile had frozen into something rigid and false. The nearby tables had heard everything. The power dynamic had shifted just slightly, but enough that she felt it. She opened her mouth to respond. But before she could speak, a figure approached from across the ballroom. Someone who had been watching the entire exchange. Someone whose presence would change everything. Luther Thornton was walking toward our table, and he was looking at Lorraine with the kind of respect Saskia had spent all night trying to destroy. Luther Thornton, 68. White-haired and carrying the bearing of a man who had captained ships before captaining boardrooms, walked across the ballroom floor with singular purpose. He passed Saskia without a glance, walked right past the bride in her layers of silk, and headed straight for Lorraine. "Lorraine," he said, his voice warm with genuine affection. "I didn't know you would be here. I want you to know the favor you did for my family back in 2019, when my business was on the brink of collapse. I have never forgotten it." Lorraine looked up, startled. Her face flushed. "Oh, Luther, it was a small thing. You didn't even let me know you did it." He continued, his hand finding hers and holding it with the kind of respect you reserve for people who've earned it. "I only found out later. From Celeste, actually, when she mentioned you'd called in a favor on my behalf." I looked at Lorraine. She'd never told me. Whatever she'd done in 2019, whatever favor she'd called in, whatever string she'd pulled to help Luther Thornton save his shipping business, she'd done it quietly, without fanfare, without asking for recognition. Luther turned to me, extended his hand. His grip was firm, the kind that came from decades of shaking hands with men who measured you by how you held yourself. "Your wife is a remarkable woman, Ernest," he said. "Not Preston's mother, not the mother of the groom. My wife, a woman in her own right." I know," I said. Luther squeezed Lorraine's hand once more, nodded to both of us, and walked back to his table. Saskia watched him go, her smile frozen in place, confusion flickering behind her eyes. Lorraine had spent the entire evening being made to feel like an inconvenience, too slow, too broken, too visible, too much. And in 30 seconds, a man worth $40 million had undone all of it. You cannot manufacture that kind of respect. You can only earn it. 5 minutes later, Margaret Spencer, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, appeared at Lorraine's elbow. "Ah, Mrs. Garrison," she said hesitantly. "I don't know if you remember me, Margaret, from the insurance advocacy group. What you did when my husband's claim was denied. You saved us." Lorraine stood slowly, careful with her cane, and embraced the woman. "Of course I remember you," Lorraine said. "How is David? Is his treatment going well?" "He's in remission," Margaret said, her eyes wet. "Because of you. Because you knew who to call, what to say, how to get the insurance company to reverse their decision. We would have lost everything." They talked for 2 minutes, quiet, genuine, the kind of conversation that happens between two people who've been through something real together. Margaret thanked her 3 more times before returning to her table. Saskia's smile had started to slip. 3 minutes after that, Robert Ashford, a tall man in his early 60s, with the weathered hands of someone who'd done real work, approached the table. "Lorraine," he said, his voice deep and certain, "I wanted to thank you again for volunteering at the food bank every week during lockdown. You showed up when no one else would. Some of those families, they still ask about you." Lorraine's face brightened. "Robert, how's the food bank? Are you still running the Tuesday distributions?" "Every week," he said. "We could use you back if you're feeling up to it after your recovery." "I'd like that," Lorraine said softly. Robert shook my hand before he left. "You're a lucky man," he told me. "I know," I said. 3 people. 3 separate approaches. 3 people who had no connection to each other except one thing, Lorraine. They didn't know Preston. They didn't congratulate Saskia. They didn't acknowledge the wedding or the ceremony or the 5-tier cake. They came for Lorraine. Saskia leaned close to Preston, her voice tight with something that sounded like fear masquerading as confusion. "Why do all these people know her?" she whispered, but loud enough that I heard it from across the table. "Who is she?" Preston shrugged. Actually shrugged, like it was a mystery he'd never considered worth solving. "I don't know," he said. "Mom's always doing stuff. Charity things, I guess." I never really asked. He looked at Lorraine like she was a stranger, like he was seeing her for the first time. Except he wasn't seeing her. He was seeing what other people saw when they looked at her. The insurance advocate, the food bank volunteer, the woman who quietly made phone calls to save businesses, who showed up every Tuesday during a pandemic when no one else would. The woman who baked birthday cakes and planned weddings and recovered from broken bones without complaint. The woman who apologized for existing, his mother, and he had never thought to ask who she really was, what she did with her days, who she helped, what kind of person the world saw when they looked at her. He'd only ever seen her as an obstacle, a source of funding, someone to manage, someone who moved too slowly and needed too much space and didn't match the color scheme. Saskia's hand gripped Preston's arm. "This is weird," she said. "Why are they all ignoring me? I'm the bride." She was the bride, in her custom gown and professional makeup and 5-tier cake. And every person who mattered in this room was walking past her to thank the woman she'd spent all evening trying to erase. Lorraine sat at the table, her cheeks still flushed from the attention, her cake half-eaten, her cane resting against her chair, exactly where I'd placed it. She looked at me across the table. I raised my wine glass. She raised hers. We didn't need to say anything. Saskia watched the exchange, her smile now completely gone, replaced by something harder, sharper. Preston looked at his mother as if seeing a stranger. Who was she? He had never thought to ask. He'd only ever thought about what she could give him. Never about who she actually was. When the best man stepped up to the microphone at 8:15 p.m., I noticed immediately what was missing from the program. Saskia had designed my name. The father of the groom erased as deliberately as she had tried to erase Lorraine all evening. Tyler Hendricks, Preston's best man and college drinking buddy, stepped up with a folded piece of paper covered in jokes that carefully avoided mentioning the word family. "Preston and I go way back to state," Tyler said, grinning at the crowd. "And let me tell you, this guy could party. Remember that time you got locked out of the dorm in your underwear? Classic Preston." Laughter rippled through the ballroom. Preston raised his glass, laughing along, playing his part perfectly. Tyler went on for 3 minutes. Stories about beer pong tournaments. Stories about spring break in Cancun. Stories about Preston convincing his economics professor to curve the final because half the class had failed. Not once did he mention who paid for that college education. Not once did he mention the parents who sent checks every month, who drove 6 hours each way for Parents' Weekend, who sat through graduation in 90-degree heat to watch their son walk across that stage. We didn't exist in Tyler's version of Preston's life. The best man finished to applause and stepped aside. Amber Reed, Saskia's maid of honor and fellow social media influencer, took the microphone next. She wore a champagne-colored dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her speech was delivered with the practiced cadence of someone who'd rehearsed in front of a mirror. "Saskia has always known exactly what she wanted," Amber said, her voice bright and confident. "She never settles for less than perfect. And Preston, you're perfect for her because you give her everything she asks for." More applause. Amber went on about Saskia's Instagram aesthetic, about her eye for detail, about how she'd planned this wedding for 8 months and executed it flawlessly. 8 months. Lorraine had planned it for 8 months. Lorraine had called florists and tasted cakes and interviewed photographers and negotiated contracts, while Saskia posed for photos and picked color schemes. But Amber's speech made it sound like Saskia had done everything herself. No mention of Lorraine. No mention of me. No mention of the parents who paid for the Fairmont Copley Plaza ballroom, the 5-tier cake, the string quartet, the photographer, the flowers, the food, the open bar. We had been edited out of our own son's wedding. Not once did they mention Lorraine. Not once did they mention the parents who paid for that college education, who built the foundation these two were standing on. I looked at Lorraine. She sat in the candlelight, her hands folded in her lap, her cake half-eaten, trying to be invisible. Exactly as Saskia had demanded. The speeches concluded to applause. Guests raised their glasses. The string quartet began playing something soft and romantic. They were celebrating. They were toasting to forever. And they had no idea they were standing in a building I had already condemned. They just couldn't see the structural cracks yet. I pulled out my phone beneath the table. One last text. One final piece to remove before the weight shifted, and everything came down. I typed slowly, deliberately. To cancel Preston's name from the company succession plan. Effective immediately. Celeste's response came back in 6 seconds. Done. All succession documents voided. Garrison Maritime Construction remains solely under your control. 42 years. 42 years I'd spent building that company from nothing. From a single warehouse renovation contract to a maritime construction empire that employed 300 people. From hand-mixing concrete in my 20s to consulting on harbor projects across the eastern seaboard in my 60s. 42 years of early mornings and late nights and weekends on job sites. 42 years of building something meant to outlast me. 3 words and it was gone. Not destroyed, redirected to people who would actually earn it. I set the phone face down on the table and looked at Saskia. She was laughing at something Preston had whispered in her ear. Her hand rested on his shoulder. Her dress layers of silk and tulle spread across the chair beneath her. Beneath that dress, construction-grade epoxy had been curing for 2 hours and 25 minutes. The chemical reaction was complete now. The adhesive had moved through its tacky phase, through its bonding phase, into permanent fusion. The kind of bond I'd use to attach steel beams to concrete foundations. The kind that held up buildings designed to stand for a century. She wasn't stuck to the chair anymore. She was part of it. Every shift of her weight over the past 2 hours had spread the adhesive deeper into the fabric. Every wiggle to adjust her dress had pressed silk threads into molecular contact with industrial polymer. Her body heat had accelerated the curing. The pressure of sitting had maximized surface area. Physics and chemistry working exactly as designed. She had no idea, neither did he. Preston raised his champagne glass toward Saskia. She clinked hers against his. They kissed long, performative, for the cameras still capturing every moment. The penthouse was gone. The locks were changed. The honeymoon was canceled. The flights were forfeited. The monthly account was closed. The trust fund was dissolved. The company's succession was voided. The inheritance was redirected. Every financial gift I'd prepared, every asset I'd planned to transfer, every dollar they'd counted on gone. And they sat there drinking champagne, completely unaware that the ground beneath them had already been removed. The fuse was lit. The building was already dead. It just hadn't fallen yet. I had spent my life in construction. I knew exactly what a controlled demolition looked like. You don't blow everything at once. You remove support beams strategically. You let physics do the work. You wait for the weight of the structure to realize it has nothing left to stand on, and then you watch it come down. I put my phone down and poured myself another glass of Cabernet. The speeches were over. The toasts were done. The first dance would begin in 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, Saskia would try to stand. In 10 minutes, the trap she had set for my wife would close on her instead. And I would sit here calm and still and watch gravity do what gravity does, pull down everything that was built on a rotten foundation. The MC's voice cut through the reception hall like a blade through silk, and every head turned toward our table. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus Donnelly said, his smooth voice carrying across the ballroom with the practiced confidence of someone who'd worked 100 weddings. He was in his early 40s, microphone in hand, standing at the center of the dance floor. "Please welcome to the floor for their first dance as husband and wife, Preston and Saskia Garrison." Applause erupted. 200 guests turned their attention to us. The spotlight swung across the ballroom, bright, theatrical, designed for this exact moment. It landed on our table like a searchlight bathing Preston and Saskia in white light. Music began. A romantic ballad. Piano and strings. The kind of song that gets played at every wedding because it sounds expensive and makes people cry. This song was personally chosen by the bride 6 months ago. Marcus added his voice warm with that professional sentimentality that wedding MCs perfect. A song about forever. 6 months ago. 6 months of planning this perfect moment. 6 months of choosing songs and coordinating lighting and rehearsing their choreography. And in 3 hours, I'd reversed everything they'd built. Preston's face lit up. He looked at Saskia with the kind of anticipation you see in movies, the groom gazing at his bride, ready to sweep her onto the dance floor, ready to begin their forever. Saskia maintained her perfect smile, the one she'd practiced in mirrors, the one that looked flawless in photographs, but I was watching her hands. Preston stood smoothly, adjusted his tuxedo jacket, straightened his bow tie. Every movement confident, rehearsed exactly as they'd planned. He stepped around the table toward Saskia, extended his hand. The gesture was romantic, theatrical, designed for the cameras. His palm-up fingers slightly curved the universal symbol of invitation. "May I have this dance?" he said loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, playing his role perfectly. Guests pulled out their phones. 200 phones rose into the air like a coordinated salute. Everyone wanted to capture this moment. The first dance. The beginning of forever. The Instagram-worthy scene Saskia had spent 6 months engineering. Saskia's smile didn't waver, but her fingers gripped the table edge. just for a split second, just long enough that I saw it. Her knuckles whitened against the white tablecloth. A micro movement. A hesitation so brief that if you blinked, you'd miss it. Then she released, smoothed her dress, reached for Preston's hand. My heart was hammering. I could feel it in my throat, in my wrists, in my temples. 42 years of building, 42 years of trusting, 42 years of believing in the boy I'd raised, all of it condensing into this single moment. Lorraine's hand found mine beneath the table. I squeezed. She squeezed back. Before I show you what happened when she tried to stand, are you still with me? Comment A if you think she'll realize something's wrong before she moves, or B if she has no idea. Add one short reason. Please note the next part includes fictionalized details for storytelling impact. Saskia released the table edge completely, placed her hand in Preston's. Her fingers curled around his palm. The romantic gesture. The bride accepting the groom's invitation. The moment every wedding photographer waits for. She took a visible breath, positioned her feet beneath her. I watched her shift her weight forward, preparing to stand. The same motion people make 1,000 times a day without thinking. Push with your legs. Transfer weight to your feet. Stand. Simple, except it wasn't. Because 2 hours and 40 minutes ago, Saskia had sat down in that chair. 2 hours and 40 minutes of body heat activating industrial strength epoxy. 2 hours and 40 minutes of pressure distributing adhesive across every thread of silk touching that velvet cushion. 2 hours and 40 minutes of chemical bonding at the molecular level. I looked across the ballroom and met Lorraine's eyes. She was 70 feet away, sitting safely in the clean chair I'd moved her to. The chair with extra cushioning. The chair that had never seen epoxy. She looked back at me. We didn't need words. The moment was here. Saskia's knuckles were white where she gripped Preston's hand. Not from romance, from preparation. From the instinctive tightening of muscles before exertion. She planted her feet firmly on the marble floor, took another breath. The music swelled. Piano crescendo. The kind of moment designed for memories. 200 phones recorded. 200 witnesses watched. 200 guests waited for the bride and groom to take the floor completely unaware that they were about to see something very different than a romantic first dance. Preston smiled at Saskia. That confident smile. The smile of a man who'd gotten everything he wanted. The wedding. The bride. The penthouse he thought was his. The company he thought he'd inherit. The life he thought he'd bought with his mother's humiliation. Saskia smiled back. That perfect, practiced, Instagram-ready smile. And then she pushed. Her legs engaged. Quadriceps contracting. Body weight shifting forward and up. The simple, universal motion of standing. Except the chair came with her. The dress layers of silk and tulle, $12,000 of custom Italian craftsmanship, pulled taut against the industrial epoxy, bonding it to the velvet cushion. Physics took over. Her body tried to rise. The chair tried to stay. The fabric caught between two opposing forces had to choose. Saskia's eyes widened, just slightly, just enough. She pushed harder. The music played. The phones recorded. The spotlight held. And in the split second, before everything changed in the moment, before 200 witnesses understood what they were seeing in the breath before the trap I'd reversed, sprang closed on the woman who'd set it. She placed her hand in his, took a breath, planted her feet, pushed. Nothing happened. Saskia pushed with her legs. I saw the effort move through her body weight shifting forward, but she didn't rise. She stayed exactly where she was. Bonded. Confusion crossed her face. The micro-expression of someone who pushes a door and finds it locked, who pulls a drawer that refuses to open, who tries to stand and finds the world has other plans. She tried again, harder. Her face reddened under the spotlight. Her free hand pressed against the table edge for leverage. Nothing. The ballroom had gone silent. 200 guests watching. 200 phones recording. The music still playing, but nobody was listening. "I can't," Saskia said, her voice barely audible. "Something's wrong with the chair." Preston grabbed her arm and pulled. Both Saskia and the 18-kilogram oak chair rose 3 feet off the ground before he understood what he was holding. His grip faltered. Gravity won. They crashed down together. The chair skidded sideways. Saskia cried out, not loud, just a small, broken sound of shock. "Oh my God," someone said from the crowd. "Is she glued to it?" Glued. The word rippled through the ballroom like a stone thrown into still water. Guests leaning forward, guests whispering, guests understanding. Someone had glued the bride to her chair. At her own wedding, under the spotlight, in front of 200 witnesses, with 200 phones recording. Saskia stopped struggling. Her chest heaved. Her hands gripped the armrests. Her mind was racing. I could see it in her eyes, the way they darted around, searching for answers, searching for explanations, searching for who could have done this. The timeline, the access, the precision. Her eyes swept the ballroom, past the guests, past the phones, past Preston standing above her, with his hands still extended, like he could fix this with one more pull. Her gaze moved across 70 feet of marble floor and locked onto me. I stood beside my table, my wife safe in her clean chair beside me, my hands at my sides, my face calm, watching. Recognition dawned across Saskia's features. Not slow, not gradual. Instant, like a light switch flipping, like a door opening, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. She knew. She knew who had access to the ballroom 3 hours early. She knew who had watched them prepare their trap. She knew who had the knowledge, the materials, the motive. She knew exactly who had reversed everything they'd planned. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came out, just comprehension, just horror, just the understanding that the trap she'd set for my wife had closed on her instead. I didn't look away. I stood there 70 feet from the spotlight, 70 feet from the wreckage of her perfect day, and I looked back at her with the same calm I'd maintained for 3 hours. The same calm I'd maintained for 42 years, while I built foundations and poured concrete and taught my son how to shake hands with a firm grip. The same calm that comes from knowing exactly what you've done and why you've done it. Her eyes found mine across 70 feet of ballroom floor, across 200 witnesses, across the wreckage of what was supposed to be her perfect day. I looked back at a building I knew was already coming down. Preston made one last attempt. He moved behind Saskia, positioning himself like he was about to deadlift at the gym. Planted his feet wide, bent his knees, wrapped both arms around her rib cage just below her breasts, locking his hands together. "On 3. He said, his voice strained with determination. 1, 2. "Lee, wait, don't!" Saskia gripped his forearms, but it was too late. 3. Preston heaved upward with everything he had. College athlete strength, adrenaline-fueled desperation strength. The kind of effort you use once in your life when you're trying to save someone or prove something or both. Saskia rose, 18 inches off the chair. Her body lifted. Her legs dangled. Preston's face turned red with exertion. And then the dress gave up. The sound was unmistakable. A rip that started low and ran high like fabric screaming. One continuous tear from waist to hem, following the line where industrial-strength epoxy met $12,000 of Italian silk. Physics and chemistry meeting at $12,000 per yard. Chemistry 1. The entire rear panel of the dress, everything from her waist down to the train, stayed bonded to the oak chair like shed skin. Like a snake leaving behind what it used to be. Saskia stood in the spotlight, wearing her bodice, wearing her veil, wearing nude shapewear from the waist down, exposed. 200 phones captured everything. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The ballroom existed in that frozen moment between comprehension and reaction, between seeing and understanding, between witnessing and processing. Then someone gasped. Preston's arms dropped. He stepped back, his face draining of color. "Oh God," he whispered. "Is that her?" A woman's voice from the crowd. "Everyone's filming this," a man said, and I couldn't tell if it was observation or warning. Saskia stood motionless for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of perfect stillness, while her brain caught up to what her body already knew. Then she spun around, saw her dress, still attached to the chair. $12,000 of custom Italian silk and French lace bonded to velvet cushion by the same epoxy I'd used to attach steel beams to concrete foundations. The dress sat there like evidence, like a crime scene, like proof of what had been done to her. She saw 200 phones pointed at her. Recording, streaming, sharing, creating permanent digital documentation of this moment. She saw her reflection in the mirrored wall across the ballroom. A bride in shapewear. A woman in her underwear at her own wedding. The girl who'd spent 6 months planning every detail, every photo, every Instagram perfect moment, reduced to this. Her mind was racing. I could see it in her eyes. The way they darted. The way her breathing accelerated. The way her hands trembled. Industrial adhesive. Deliberate placement. Surgical precision. Someone did this. Someone planned this. Someone knew exactly where she would sit, exactly how long the epoxy would need to cure, exactly when to strike. "This isn't," she said to herself, breathing fast. Preston reached for her, pulling off his tuxedo jacket. "Here, take my jacket," he said. But Saskia wasn't hearing him. Her mind had locked onto something else. Something more important than modesty. More important than the phones. More important than the 200 witnesses watching her stand in her underwear. The chair. The chair had been moved. She'd put the epoxy on Lorraine's chair. She'd been so careful. She'd checked the place cards. She'd made sure. But the chair was wrong. The cards had been swapped. Someone had known. Someone had been there. Someone had reversed the trap. Panic and fury rose in her chest, like competing tides crashing into each other, creating something volatile and unstable and completely beyond her control. Every survival instinct screamed at her to stay silent, to accept Preston's jacket, to let him lead her off the dance floor, to salvage what could be salvaged. But rage doesn't listen to survival instincts. Rage demands answers. Rage demands justice. Rage demands someone pay for what just happened. She spun to face the crowd, chest heaving, hands clenched into fists, voice rising from somewhere deep and primal and furious. "Who moved my chair?" The words exploded across the ballroom. Raw, desperate, accusatory. Preston froze. "What?" he said, his voice barely audible. But Saskia wasn't done. The floodgates had opened. The confession was pouring out before her brain could stop it. "Someone moved my chair," she said, her voice breaking, now tears streaming through her makeup. "I put it, who moved it back? I put it." 3 words that changed everything. The question hung in the spotlit air like a confession written in neon, like evidence presented to a jury, like the moment in a trial when the defendant admits guilt while trying to claim innocence. She'd just told 200 people, 200 witnesses with 200 recording phones, that she had put something on a chair, that she'd set a trap, that she'd expected someone else to sit there, that this wasn't an accident or a prank or a mistake. This was sabotage. Her sabotage, reversed. The ballroom was silent, completely silent. Even the music had stopped. The string quartet had given up pretending anyone was listening. 200 people stood frozen, phone screens glowing, recording lights blinking, processing, understanding. The bride had just confessed to sabotaging her own wedding, which meant she'd meant it for someone else, which meant someone had reversed it, which meant this wasn't random cruelty. This was justice. The words echoed across marble and crystal, across white hydrangeas and 5-tier cake, across 200 witnesses holding 200 recording devices. 200 people arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. Saskia's finger found its target. She spun away from the stunned crowd, away from the 200 phones recording her confession, away from the dress still bonded to the chair. Her eyes locked onto Lorraine, 15 feet away, sitting in her clean chair with her cane resting beside her. Safe. Untouched. Exactly where I'd moved her 3 hours ago. I watched Saskia's mind work. Saw the desperate calculation flash across her face. The survival instinct overriding shame, overriding logic, overriding everything except the primal need to shift blame. Find a scapegoat. Survive this. Her hand lifted, shaking, pointing directly at her mother-in-law. Saskia's voice broke on the word. Lorraine looked up, confused. What? You did this? Saskia's voice rose louder, now gaining momentum from desperation. You, she lunged, not elegantly, not with grace, with pure, uncontrolled rage. Her hand slammed into the crystal centerpiece on the table, white hydrangeas Lorraine had chosen months ago, sending it crashing to the marble floor. Crystal exploded. Water spread, flowers scattered. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot, like a marriage ending. You moved the chair. Saskia screamed, her face contorted, her carefully applied makeup running with sweat and tears. You knew about the glue. Lorraine backed away, her cane clattering as she tried to stand, tried to retreat, tried to make sense of what was happening. I don't understand, she said, her voice small. You swapped them. Saskia was fully hysterical now, beyond reason, beyond control. You wanted this to happen to me. You've always hated me. You've always been jealous. 200 phones captured every word. 200 witnesses watched the bride in her shapewear accuse the mother of the groom of sabotage, and some of them were believing it. I saw it in their faces. The uncertainty, the doubt, the human tendency to believe whoever speaks loudest, whoever claims victimhood first, whoever creates the most compelling narrative. Saskia was creating a narrative, the cruel mother-in-law, the jealous older woman, the bitter, broken person who couldn't stand to see her son happy. It was brilliant in its way. It was also a lie. Preston stepped beside Saskia. His face was contorted with confusion and rage, two emotions fighting for dominance, neither one winning. He turned toward his mother, not toward his bride in shapewear, not toward the 200 witnesses, toward Lorraine. Why, Mom? His voice cracked. Why would you sabotage my wedding? Lorraine's face crumpled. I didn't, she said, tears streaming now. I would never. Why do you always make everything about yourself? Preston's voice rose. He was shouting now, at his mother, at the woman who'd baked him birthday cakes for 36 years. Why can't you just let me be happy? Lorraine collapsed into her chair, not gracefully, not carefully. Her cane knocked aside, her body folding into itself like something breaking under too much weight. I was beside her in 3 steps. My hand found her shoulder, checking, not just steadying. She was shaking, but upright. No sharp intake of breath that meant bone pain, no sudden pallor. The fall had been onto a cushioned seat, not onto the floor. She was hurt in the ways that matter less than the body, and intact in the ways that matter most. She sobbed, great heaving sobs that shook her shoulders, and then she said the words that broke something in my chest. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Sorry. For something she didn't do. For something that was done to her. For existing in a way that inconvenienced people. I'd watched my wife apologize for breathing for 44 years. I'd watched her make herself smaller, quieter, less visible, so other people could feel bigger. I'd watched her spend 8 months planning this wedding. I'd watched her break her pelvis and still show up, because she refused to miss her son's day. I'd watched her be denied bread and cake and basic human dignity, and now I was watching her apologize for being framed. Enough. I stood. My chair scraped against marble loud enough to cut through Saskia's hysteria, through Preston's accusations, through the chaos consuming the ballroom, loud enough that 200 heads turned. I didn't rush, didn't run, didn't grab or shout or make a scene. I walked, slowly, deliberately, around the table to where Lorraine sat crying, her hands covering her face, her body shaking with sobs and unearned guilt. I placed my hand on her shoulder. One word, spoken with absolute certainty and controlled fury. Enough! The ballroom went silent. Not the silence of waiting. Not the silence of anticipation. The silence of command. Of authority recognized and respected. Of a man who'd spent 42 years building things, saying this far and no farther. Preston turned toward me. Dad. Enough, I repeated. I looked down at Lorraine. Her hands still covered her face. Her shoulders still shook. Stop apologizing, I said gently. Just to her. Just for her ears. Her hands lowered slowly. She looked up at me with red eyes, wet cheeks, a lifetime of trained guilt written across her features. She started. You did nothing, I said. Nothing. I turned to face the ballroom. 200 guests, 200 phones, 200 witnesses who just watched my son and his bride attack an innocent woman. Saskia stood in her shapewear chest, heaving mascara, running finger still pointed at Lorraine, like an accusation frozen in time. Preston stood beside her, confusion starting to crack through the rage, the first seeds of doubt beginning to grow. The room was completely silent. 200 guests, 200 phones, one hand on one shoulder. Waiting for me to speak, waiting for the truth, waiting to understand what they'd just witnessed. I began speaking, not loudly, not with a microphone, just the voice I'd used for 42 years on harbor construction sites, when I needed 300 workers to hear me over pneumatic drills and concrete mixers. The voice that carried, the voice that commanded. For those who don't know, I said my words reaching every corner of the ballroom without effort. My wife broke her pelvis 6 weeks ago. Every phone in the room was pointed at me, recording, streaming, creating permanent documentation. Good. I wanted this recorded. Hairline fracture. I continued. L4 and L5 vertebrae. She's been in physical therapy 3 times a week since. I felt Lorraine's shoulder beneath my hand. Felt her breathing. Felt her trying to make herself smaller even now. The break happened in early August, I said. A fall in our kitchen. Bad luck. Bad timing. The kind of injury that happens to people in their 60s when bones start to weaken. Guests were leaning forward, listening. Some of them had seen Lorraine's cane. Some had noticed her careful movements. Now they were understanding. The orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Hendricks at Mass General, gave very specific instructions. I said, no sudden movements, no twisting, no stress on the lower spine. I paused. Let the silence build. Let them wait. The doctor said sudden jerking could displace the fracture. Another pause. Permanent paralysis from the waist down. I let that sink in. Permanent paralysis. The words hung in the air like smoke. Preston and Saskia were in the room when he said it. Saskia's face drained of color. Actually drained. I watched the blood leave her cheeks like someone had opened a valve. Preston's mouth opened, closed. No sound came out. The room felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been written, where the jury already knew, where the only thing left was the formal reading. They were both there. I continued, my voice steady, factual, the tone of someone presenting evidence. July 30th, 2:15 p.m., Dr. Hendricks's office, Mass General Hospital. They drove Lorraine to the appointment because she couldn't sit in a car for long periods. I looked at Preston. His face had gone pale. They heard the doctor explain that if Lorraine experienced sudden jerking, if someone pulled her arm, if someone yanked her upward, if she tried to stand while bonded to a heavy object, the bone fragment could shift, could pinch the sciatic nerve, could leave her paralyzed for life. The ballroom was absolutely silent. No one moved. No one breathed. 200 people understanding what I was saying. Understanding what Preston and Saskia had planned. Not humiliation. Not embarrassment. Permanent physical harm. Disablement. A life sentence. They knew, I said simply. They knew exactly what could happen. And 3 hours before this reception, they applied industrial-strength construction epoxy to a chair they believed my wife would sit in. Saskia made a sound. Not a word. Just a small, broken noise. Now, I said, and my voice shifted. Became businesslike. Became the voice I used in boardrooms and contract negotiations in moments where money changed hands and futures were decided. I had prepared certain wedding gifts. I saw Preston's eyes widen slightly. Saw him recognize the past tense. Had prepared, not have prepared. Had. So I had prepared a $2.3 million penthouse in Back Bay, I said. 3 bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows, harbor views. I spent 14 months overseeing the renovation myself. Brazilian hardwood, Carrara marble, custom fixtures. I let them picture it, let them calculate the value. Instead, I had prepared succession for my maritime construction company. I continued. Garrison Maritime. 42 years of building. 300 employees. Contracts across the eastern seaboard. Everything I'd spent my adult life creating. Preston's jaw was tight. His hands were clenched. He knew where this was going. I had prepared $10,000 in monthly support, I said. Living expenses, travel, the kind of financial foundation that lets a young couple build a life without worrying about rent or groceries, or whether they can afford to start a family. I paused, looked at Preston, looked at Saskia in her shapewear and ruined makeup, looked at 200 witnesses holding 200 phones. All of it is revoked, I said. The words landed like stones. The penthouse, the company, the support, everything remains mine. Dad. Preston's voice cracked. Just one word. Just that plea. But I wasn't done. Stu. The deed transfer was scheduled for Monday morning, I said. 9 a.m. My attorney had the documents ready. Preston's name was going on the title. The keys were going to be handed over at the reception tonight. I pulled my phone from my pocket, held it up so they could see. At 5:47 p.m. this evening, 3 hours ago, I sent a text to my executive assistant, Celeste Mercer. I instructed her to cancel the deed transfer, to list the penthouse for sale, to change the locks. Saskia made that sound again, that broken, desperate noise. The succession documents were voided at 8:22 p.m. I continued. 20 minutes ago, Preston's name removed from all corporate paperwork. The company remains solely under my control. My son's face looked exactly like his 5-year-old self, realizing he'd broken something that couldn't be fixed. That look of dawning comprehension, of understanding that sorry wouldn't make it better, that crying wouldn't undo it, that some things once broken stay broken. The monthly support account was closed at 6:50 p.m., I said. Preston's access revoked. The honeymoon package was canceled at 6:48 p.m., $25,000 forfeited. I looked at them both, at the son I'd raised, at the daughter-in-law who'd taught him cruelty. They stopped being heirs the moment they sat in that orthopedist's office and started planning, I said. They just hadn't known it yet. Preston's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket with shaking hands, looked at the screen. His face went white. I reached across the table and took the phone from him, turned it so everyone nearby could see. The text was from my property manager. Sent to Preston at 6:47 p.m. 2 hours ago, while he was still getting ready for the ceremony. Have Back Bay penthouse listed. Locks changed. Personal belongings transferred to climate-controlled storage unit. Access code will be sent separately. Preston read it out loud, his voice hollow. Locks changed. 6:47 p.m. Saskia grabbed the phone. Read it. Read it again. Read it a third time like the words might change if she looked hard enough. That was before the ceremony even started, she said, her voice shaking. 2 hours ago, I confirmed, yes, the disinheritance wasn't a threat, wasn't a punishment delivered in anger. It was an accomplished fact. A foundation removed while they were still standing on it, still smiling for photos, still toasting to their future. They'd lost everything before they even said their vows. Quentin Caldwell, my attorney for 18 years, specialist in estate law and elder protection, stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the wall. He approached our table with the same measured calm he brought to every deposition, every contract negotiation, every moment where the law needed to be explained to people who didn't want to hear it. Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 265, Section 13K. He said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. Not loud, just clear, authoritative. Abuse of an elder or disabled person with serious bodily injury. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Preston and Saskia. The statute defines elder abuse as causing or permitting serious physical or emotional injury to a person 60 years or older. Quentin continued. When the abuse involves risk of serious bodily injury, in this case, permanent paralysis, the penalty is up to 10 years in state prison. 10 years. 10 years maximum sentence for what they'd planned in 90 seconds with an orange tube of epoxy. Preston's face went gray. Saskia turned to him, desperation replacing calculation. They can't prove, Shatikalai, the epoxy residue is still on the chair, Quentin said calmly. The chemical composition will match construction-grade adhesive. Your fingerprints are likely present, and you just confessed in front of 200 witnesses that you put it on a chair. He gestured to the phones, to the recording lights, to the permanent digital evidence of Saskia's own words. Whether charges are filed is not my decision, Quentin said. But the evidence exists. The witnesses exist. The crime was committed. Whether prosecution moves forward depends on many factors. He stepped back. His part was done. Sterling Vaughn, the hotel's director of events, approached next. He'd been standing near the kitchen entrance, leather portfolio in hand, waiting for the right moment. This was the right moment. Mr. Garrison, he said, addressing Preston. I apologize for the timing, but there's a matter of the final invoice. He opened the portfolio, pulled out an itemized statement, set it on the table in front of Preston. The total for this evening's ceremony, reception, and accommodations is $81,422, Sterling said. His voice was professional, neutral, the tone of someone who'd delivered bad news before. Payment authorization was declined at 8:15 p.m., 45 minutes ago, while the toasts were being given, while Preston and Saskia were still celebrating. But you said, Preston looked at me stunned. You said you'd cover the wedding. You said, so I said I'd arranged everything, I corrected. And I did. I arranged the venue, I arranged the vendors, I arranged for payment authorization to be declined at 8:15 p.m. Saskia stared at the invoice, at the number. $81,000 for one night, for the perfect wedding, for the Instagram-worthy celebration that was now permanently documented as a public disaster. How are we supposed to, she started. She didn't finish, because Luther Thornton stood, 73 years old, fourth-generation Boston maritime family, the man who'd mentored me through my first harbor contract in 1981, the man who'd been my friend for 40 years, the man who'd held Preston the day he was born. He placed his napkin beside his plate with deliberate care, pushed his chair back, stood with the slow dignity of someone who'd made a decision and would not be swayed. And he walked toward the exit, not fast, not angry, just done. "Mr. Thornton," Preston called out, desperation cracking his voice. Luther didn't respond, didn't glance back, didn't acknowledge that he'd heard. He just kept walking. 3 other couples stood. VIP guests. Boston elite. People whose names appeared on museum wings and hospital foundations. People whose approval Preston had spent years cultivating. They placed their napkins down. They walked, not in a rush, not making a scene, just leaving, rendering judgment through absence. "They're all leaving," Saskia whispered. "Not all of them. Most stayed. Stayed to watch. Stayed to record. Stayed to witness the complete collapse. But the ones who mattered to Preston's future, the maritime contacts, the construction executives, the old money families who controlled Boston's business infrastructure, they left. They walked out those ballroom doors, taking Preston's social capital with them. His connections, his reputation, his future in the circles he'd spent his adult life trying to penetrate. Gone. I watched them go. Watched Preston watch them go. Watched Saskia realize that even if they somehow scraped together money for the hotel bill, even if they avoided criminal charges, even if they rebuilt from nothing, they'd be rebuilding as outcasts, as the couple who tried to paralyze the groom's disabled mother, as people who couldn't be trusted, as examples of what happens when ambition turns cruel. I had needed 200 witnesses to see what my son became. I had needed the truth spoken in front of phones and cameras. Both did their job. "Ready?" I turned to Lorraine. My hand still rested on her shoulder. Her tears had dried, but her eyes were still red. She looked up at me and nodded. I offered my arm. She took it without hesitation. Her hand curled around my elbow, her grip firm despite everything that had just happened. Despite the accusations, despite watching her son attack her, despite apologizing for things she didn't do, I reached for her cane with my free hand, positioned it within easy reach, made sure the grip was comfortable in her palm. 42 years of marriage teaches you things. Teaches you exactly how your wife distributes her weight when she stands. Teaches you which side needs more support. Teaches you when to offer help and when to let her maintain dignity through independence. I adjusted my stance slightly, took half a step closer, let her lean into me as much or as little as she needed. "Ready?" she said quietly. Then softer, "Thank you." We stood together, not quickly, carefully. Her broken pelvis required it. Her physical therapist's instructions were clear, slow movements, steady pressure, no sudden shifts. I matched her pace exactly. We turned toward the ballroom exit. 200 pairs of eyes followed us. I felt their attention like a physical weight. Felt them watching every step. Felt the phones tracking our movement across the marble floor. But not one person looked at the bride. Not one camera pointed at Saskia anymore. The bride in her shapewear. The bride with her torn dress still bonded to a chair. The bride who'd just confessed to attempted assault. She'd been erased, not by me, by her own choices, by natural consequence. "They're all watching," Lorraine whispered. "Let them," I said. Her cane clicked against marble. One step, then another. The rhythm of recovery. The rhythm of a woman who'd been told she might never walk without assistance, but refused to let that be her story. Click, step, slow. Steady, dignified. "Not watching her," Lorraine said, and I heard something like wonder in her voice. Watching us. She was right. Every step was a declaration. Every measured movement across that ballroom floor was a statement about what a marriage looks like when it's built on something real. Not on money, not on manipulation, not on what you can extract from each other, on showing up, on protecting, on 42 years of choosing each other when it would have been easier not to. We reached the ballroom doors, passed through into the Fairmont Copley Plaza lobby. It was quieter here. The chaos of the ballroom muffled by heavy doors and thick carpet. Piano music drifted from the bar, something soft, something old, something that belonged to a different era. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across marble columns and polished floors. Lorraine stopped, not because she needed to rest, though I'm sure her hip was screaming after everything she'd been through tonight. She stopped because she was looking around, seeing the space, remembering. Her eyes brightened. Not with tears this time, with something else. Do you remember?" she asked. "Remember what? The first time we came here." I looked around the lobby, the grand staircase, the bar with its leather chairs and mahogany paneling, the entrance where valets had once parked our 15-year-old Honda that barely ran. I remembered. 1981. I said. She smiled. A real smile. The first one I'd seen all night that reached her eyes. "You just signed your first major harbor contract," she said. "The warehouse renovation on Long Wharf. $300,000. More money than we'd ever seen." "Most money I'd ever been responsible for," I corrected. "We didn't have it yet. Just the contract. Just the promise. You brought me here." Lorraine continued, her voice soft with memory. "Drove straight from the signing to pick me up. I was still in my work clothes. You were in that brown suit that didn't quite fit. The suit I'd bought at a discount store. The suit I'd worn to every important meeting for 3 years because I couldn't afford another one. You ordered champagne," she said. I remembered the waiter's face. The way he'd looked at us young broke clearly out of place in a hotel like this. "Bought it with the rent money," I said. "I asked if we could afford it," Lorraine said. "You remember what you told me? Celebrate first," I said. "Worry about money later." She'd bet everything on me with champagne and rent money, with a promise that a contract would turn into actual payment, with faith that the brown suit and the barely running Honda would somehow transform into something stable. She'd been 23 years old. She could have said no, could have told me I was being reckless, could have demanded proof before celebration. But she'd raised that champagne glass and toasted to our future with absolute trust. "I trusted you then," Lorraine said quietly. Her hand tightened on my arm. "I trust you now." 42 years. 42 years since that champagne. Since that brown suit. Since that warehouse contract that turned into a career that turned into an empire. 42 years of rent paid. Of contracts honored. Of showing up when I said I would. Of building things meant to last. 42 years of her trusting me, and me earning it, every single day. That kind of trust. The kind where you buy champagne with rent money and your wife doesn't question it, is built with 42 years of showing up. Not inheritance plans, not prenuptial agreements, not manipulation or control or keeping score, just showing up every day. For 42 years, Lorraine's hand trembled slightly as she pulled a black velvet box from her beaded clutch. We stood beneath the portico while Marcus brought the car around the September air, still warm enough that she hadn't needed the wrap I'd draped over her shoulders earlier in the evening. I recognized the box immediately small, the kind jewelers reserve for significant pieces. I'd watched her slide it into her nightstand drawer 3 weeks ago when I came looking for cufflinks. She'd smiled then and said something about being ready when the time came. I hadn't asked what she meant. Now I understood. "I spent 2 years saving for these," she said, opening the lid. Diamond earrings caught the amber glow from the hotel's entrance lights. Art Deco settings, vintage platinum halos, the kind of pieces I'd seen dog-eared in the estate jewelry catalogs she left on the coffee table. The jeweler on Newbury Street had held them while she paid in installments of $200 every month, 24 quiet months of small economies and patient intention. "For Saskia," she said. I stared at the stones. Each had to be at least a carat flawless, even to my untrained eye. She'd chosen them for history, for permanence, for a daughter-in-law she'd believed would appreciate something that had survived a century already. "Preston knew," she added. "He helped me pick the setting. The words settled between us like evidence at a trial neither of us had wanted to attend. Preston had known about the earrings. He'd known his mother had sacrificed small comforts across 2 years to buy them, known she'd chosen every detail with his bride in mind. And still he'd helped Saskia position that chair. Still he'd stood in that ballroom and let it happen. Lorraine's fingers closed slowly around the box. "I'm keeping them," she said. No question in her voice, no request for permission from anyone. "I'll wear them in the greenhouse when I'm repotting the orchids I brought back from Helen's estate sale. I'll wear them reading on the porch, watching the harbor at sunset. I'll wear them having coffee at our kitchen table on Sunday mornings when the light comes through the east window." She looked up at me, her eyes bright but completely dry. "I earned them. Not for a bride who thought I was dispensable. For myself. I wanted to tell her she deserved more than earrings. That she deserved a son who had valued what she was, who had understood what it cost her to love him as steadily as she had for 36 years. But Marcus pulled up in the Bentley before I could find words that didn't sound hollow against the weight of the night. I helped her into the passenger seat, careful of her back, and settled beside her as Marcus pulled onto Dartmouth Street. We turned onto Commonwealth Avenue, the tree-lined median dark, except for occasional streetlights filtering through leaves. Victorian brownstones passed in silence on both sides, their lit windows hinting at lives that had not collapsed tonight. Families eating dinner and watching television and doing ordinary things in ordinary rooms, unaware that some of us were riding through the city, carrying the wreckage of something we'd spent decades building. Lorraine tucked the velvet box back into her clutch and folded her hands in her lap. I'd expected tears now that we were alone, now that the performance was over and there was no one left to be composed for. But she sat steady breathing, even watching the city move past her window, and I understood that the composure had never been a performance at all. It had been real. She had walked out of that ballroom with her head high, not because she was suppressing something, but because she had already decided who she was going to be on the other side of it. "I have one regret," I said as we passed Kenmore Square. Lorraine turned slightly toward me, careful not to twist her back. "Just one. Everything else I'd do again, exactly the same." I kept my eyes on the road ahead, watching taillights blur into red streaks in the dark. The cameras, the chair, the revelation in front of 200 witnesses, every second of it. But I'd change one thing. I felt her waiting. "I should have protected you sooner. Years sooner. The first time Preston spoke to you with contempt, and I told myself it was just a phase. The first time he chose Saskia's cruelty over your kindness, and I made excuses about young love making people careless with the people who loved them most. The first time I watched you absorb something that should have been deflected, and I chose loyalty to my son over protection for my wife." The Bentley slowed for a red light at Massachusetts Avenue. I'd spent 40 years building a company, 36 years raising a son who had become a stranger somewhere along the way, and I had never identified the precise moment when my priorities inverted, when I began protecting the wrong person in the room. "You weren't wrong to love him," Lorraine said quietly. "You were wrong to think I needed less of that love to make room for his." The light changed. Marcus accelerated smoothly, and we continued down Commonwealth Avenue toward Brookline, toward the house that would feel different now. Smaller, maybe. Quieter, certainly. Its locks changed, its third bedroom emptied of the childhood furniture I'd refused for years to donate, holding onto the room the way you hold onto a version of someone that no longer exists. Lorraine's hand found mine on the seat between us. Her fingers were cool and certain, the same way they had been for 42 years, whenever the ground shifted beneath us, and we needed to confirm the other was still there. She didn't offer forgiveness or absolution, or reassurance that I'd done enough. Just held my hand while the city gave way to residential streets and the dashboard clock marked 9:12 on what should have been our son's wedding night. 40 years means some things are understood without being spoken. The harbor lights passed the window like memories. We crossed into the waterfront district without speaking. Lorraine's hand still in mine, the silence between us feeling less like absence and more like foundation, something solid laid down over decades, invisible, until you needed to stand on it. Marcus took the long route through the North End, past piers I'd helped resurrect, from rotting pilings and forgotten moorings. The city I'd spent 40 years building rose around us in glass and steel and reclaimed brick, a skyline assembled from soil tests and structural calculations and 10,000 decisions made before sunrise. I knew these streets the way a surgeon knows anatomy, not just the surface, but the systems running underneath. You built half this skyline," Lorraine said quietly, watching a residential complex slide past her window. She was right. I'd overseen that conversion in 2009. 300 units where a warehouse had crumbled into obsolescence, where pigeons had nested in the crossbeams, and water had rotted the subfloor to nothing. We'd stripped it to the bones and rebuilt it from the foundation up. The Harbor District bore my fingerprints in concrete and rebar structures engineered to outlast the men who'd designed them. Every building I'd touched had started with blueprints and soil tests and calculations that left nothing to chance, because chance was how buildings fell. "Built the structures," I said. "Thought I could build a man the same way." Lorraine turned from the window. Her face caught the glow from a streetlight, then fell back into shadow as we passed. "Character doesn't work like concrete," she said. "No." I watched the Maritime Museum appear on our left, another renovation I'd managed in the 90s, a project that had nearly bankrupted us twice before we found solid ground. You can't blueprint integrity, can't pour a foundation for empathy or install load-bearing decency. I spent 36 years treating Preston like a construction project. Invest enough resources, apply enough pressure, follow the plans, and you'll get the result you engineered. The museum disappeared behind us. But people aren't buildings. You can't inspect character for code compliance. Can't stress test it in a laboratory or check it against specifications drawn up by someone wiser. Either someone chooses to stand straight under pressure or they don't. And all the investment in the world won't change what they choose when the moment comes and no one is watching. Lorraine's thumb traced slow circles on the back of my hand, the way she had since we were young, since before Preston, before the skyline, before all the things we'd built and broken and had to reckon with in the back of a car on a cold October night. "You gave him every advantage," she said. "See, I gave him everything except consequences." The words sat in the car with us, neither of us rushing past them. Every time he cracked under pressure, I reinforced him instead of letting him fail. Every time his foundation showed weakness, I poured more resources into him instead of asking why the ground beneath him wouldn't hold. I treated his failures like engineering problems. I kept believing that the right intervention at the right moment, with enough material and effort behind it, would produce the man I'd designed in my head. Marcus turned onto Hanover Street, the North End closing around us with its narrow lanes and century-old brick, the neighborhood exhaling warmth and garlic, and the particular comfort of a place that had survived everything the city had thrown at it. "You hungry?" I asked. Lorraine looked at me the way you look at someone who has just suggested something mildly absurd and completely wonderful. In a tuxedo and a formal gown, especially in a tuxedo and a formal gown, I leaned forward. "Marcus, that corner place on Salem Street. The one with the brick oven." "Caruso's," Marcus said, already signaling. "Yes, sir." Vincent Caruso, 60-something, third-generation North End. A man who had run this corner pizza shop for 30 years without changing the tablecloths or the recipe or his opinion of people who ordered without garlic, took one look at the tuxedo and gown and didn't ask a single question. just led us to a corner table with a red checkered cloth and a candle stuck in a wine bottle. The kind of setup that would have seemed quaint anywhere else, but felt precisely right here in this room on this particular night, when we needed something honest more than something elegant. The smell reached me before I'd pulled out Lorraine's chair garlic and oregano and yeast sauce simmering somewhere in the back kitchen, cheese browning in the brick oven that Vincent's grandfather had built in 1947 and no one had seen any reason to replace. Some foundations deserved to be kept. Thick crust, Lorraine said when Vincent came back with water. Everything on it. I raised an eyebrow. The doctor said you should watch the show. Tonight I'm not watching anything, Lorraine said and laughed. Actually laughed, genuine and unguarded, and full the first real sound of joy I'd heard from her since we'd left the house 9 hours ago before the ballroom and the speeches and the long ride back through everything we'd thought we understood about our family. Vincent grinned and headed back to the kitchen, like a man who had seen enough of life to recognize the moments worth leaving alone. I watched Lorraine settle into her chair, careful of her back, but not defeated by it, and I understood that something had shifted between us. Not broken. Shifted the way a structure settles after the ground beneath it finally stops moving. The woman who had stood in front of 200 witnesses and apologized to Saskia with her chin level and her voice steady was gone. This woman ordered pizza with everything on it and didn't ask permission from anyone, including herself. The greenhouse could go where the tennis court was, Lorraine said, tracing the rim of her water glass. You never liked tennis anyway. I liked pretending Preston would come home and play. He hasn't been home for a match in 8 years. Her voice stayed level, not bitter, just the plain shape of a thing she'd long since made peace with. No point maintaining a court for a fantasy. Vincent brought the pizza on a wooden paddle, thick crust, blistered from the brick oven cheese, still bubbling at the edges the way cheese should when it means it. Lorraine took a slice and bit into it without waiting for it to cool, and I found myself smiling at her impatience at this small reclamation of appetite after a night that had taken so much. We could drive to Wisconsin in October, I said, taking my own slice. See the fall colors. Stay in one of those bed and breakfasts you're always marking in the travel magazines. The ones you always call overpriced. They are overpriced, I admitted. But maybe that's not the point. We ate pizza in formal wear under candlelight, talking about orchid shelves and road trips and the real possibility of selling the Brookline house for something smaller. Something that didn't echo with empty rooms and a tennis court no one used, and the particular silence of a life built around a center that had never held. Plans made without needing anyone's permission. Just two people choosing their next chapter with the same deliberateness they'd once used to choose everything else. I watched Lorraine reach for a second slice. Watched the diamond earrings she'd reclaimed catch the candlelight and scatter it across the checkered cloth. Watched her smile at something I'd said about Wisconsin cheese curds and county fairs, and I felt 42 years of marriage compress into this single moment of choosing each other again, not from obligation, not from the inertia of shared history, not from fear of what starting over looked like at our age, but because after everything that had burned down tonight, we'd looked at what remained and decided it was enough. More than enough. It was the right material to build with. She had stopped asking permission somewhere between the ballroom and the pizza, and I hadn't noticed until now. Maybe that was the real shift. We're going to be okay, Lorraine said quietly. We already are. A different kind of okay, she said. Better. I nodded because she was right. The old okay had been built on foundations I'd never properly inspected, on assumptions about legacy and continuity, and a son I'd believed would be the load-bearing center of everything we'd worked toward. This new okay was simpler, smaller and stronger the way the best structures always are. 2 people and a greenhouse and plans for Wisconsin and pizza on a Tuesday night in the North End when the rest of it had fallen away. You can't purchase the kind of family that stands beside you when it costs them something. You can only build it one honest day at a time with whatever materials remain after the reckoning. Sometimes building means knowing what to tear down first. And to you listening to my story, remember this. Sometimes the family you protect isn't the family you plan to build. I spent 42 years building structures meant to outlast me. I thought I could construct a son the same way, pour enough resources, apply enough pressure, follow the plans. But I was wrong. Character has no blueprint. I should have protected Lorraine sooner the moment Preston showed me who he really was. Don't make my mistake. Don't confuse loyalty to blood with protecting what truly matters. Family justice isn't about revenge. It's about choosing who deserves your protection and having the courage to act when you see the truth. In all the dad's revenge stories, I could tell this one taught me the hardest lesson. Sometimes building a better foundation means tearing down what's broken first. I believe God put me through this so I could see clearly not every relationship is worth saving, but the ones that are deserve everything. True family shows up when it matters. If this story made you think about what really matters, leave a comment below. Tell me, would you have done what I did or something different? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more dad's revenge stories that dig into real truth about loyalty and protection, subscribe to Wise Revenge. Your voice matters here. Thank you for staying until the very end. I know this wasn't easy to hear. It wasn't easy to live through either. One final note: certain details in this story have been adjusted for storytelling and to protect privacy, but the lesson at its core remains true.